All right, so let me first of all introduce the project that is hosting this event, the Campaign for a Socialist Party in the United States. And I'm just going to read our 11 theses that we drafted about a year and a half ago when we got this thing started. So we are exploring interest in starting a mass socialist party in the United States. Mass means more than a sect, either small or large, because after all, there are sects that are very large, like the Catholic Church, for example. Socialist, more than merely democratic or liberal. Political, meaning going beyond social and economic actions, including but not primarily or limited to holding political office. And party, that is more than a movement or merely an organization, because we have a lot of organizations, but we don't have a party. This will, in many respects, be an unprecedented undertaking and will be, in some ways, the first real political party ever in the United States. The only precedents are the old pre-World War I Socialist Party of America, and before that, the Republican Party of the mid-19th century. We want to include as much of the present avowed left as possible, from liberals to anarchists. We find that the existing left consists of talented organizers and thinkers, but they need a new and different context to be effective. Now they are condemned to ineffectiveness, which means to more or less support the Democratic Party. We are looking ahead to a decades-long, painstaking, and patient but deliberate and serious process. The building of a mass socialist political party will fundamentally alter the political but also the social landscape in the United States and internationally, globally. The aim is to take governing power in the United States. This does not preclude and indeed aims at doing so in direct political cooperation with similar parties taking power in other countries. Last year, 2016, was a good time to begin this project because of the disarray of the existing political parties as well as of society. There is a window of opportunity with a new generation to embark on a new political task and possibility that has been avoided since the 1960s New Left and also avoided since the 1930s Old Left, both of which were conditioned and distorted by the gravitational attraction of the Democratic Party as well as the dynamics of anti-communism and the Cold War. We're past this now and so can proceed to build socialist politics free of such pressures. Last year, when we got started, the Sanders campaign was something of a distraction from this project and from this task because it was a more or less desperate attempt to reform the Democrats, which will not happen, and even if it did, would not lead to socialism in any way. All existing left social, economic, civic, legal, and political activism of all kinds should be conducted under the political banner of the struggle for socialism. We need to make all these disparate struggles coherent for any of them to be effective. Such struggles should take place in and through a socialist party. In the immediate future, the goal is to reconfigure U.S. politics in terms amenable to a socialist left. The Republicans should be the capitalist party, the Democrats should be the party of middle-class democracy. A socialist party should be for the working class in its struggle for socialism. Socialism will be the realization of the social potential made possible but held back by capitalism. We need a party to pursue the politics of this task. You should join us.
So to that end, before we get started, we thought we might pass around the sign-up sheet if anyone is interested in getting some email updates about events that the Campaign for a Socialist Party is hosting here in Chicago. You can write down your name, email address, and phone number. Pass this around. And also, Drew, could you say just a few words about the Socialist Salons that we're hosting this summer?
Yeah, so this is our first Socialist Salon. We're still trying to figure out the format. We're doing an interview format. Basically, it's going to be kind of like a soft kind of social event where we have different activists or different academics get together and just get people involved in the campaign or the Socialist Party. We'll have presentations, but it'll also be a chance to kind of socialize to projects.
And we'd also like today's event to be a little bit conversational. So before we begin, let's go around with a very brief introduction, your name, and the affiliation you choose to describe and what brings you here today. So I can start. My name is
bring all like the disparate struggles together. I have so many friends that are like teachers, or they're passionate, like they're nonprofits, they have all their little pet projects and stuff. And I think like the important thing about parties is like kind of like bring all these projects together. I'm Sam. Based out of the University affiliated with Buches through Loyola. That's where I learned about that. But I'm mostly here to learn. So I'm all here.
My name is Thomas. I'm just interested in the campaign for the Socialist Party. I can't say I've worked too much in it, but some of the more historical aspects of
I'm Gregor. I have an innumerable amount of affiliations. Die Linke, Germany, the academic affiliation, Marxist Theory group, and also the campaign for the Socialist Party. I joined the Socialist Party USA too.
No real strict affiliations. Just in the water, so I've been involved with the Socialist Party and this campaign as well. Forrest.
I'm Danny. I am a member of the Chicago Socialist Party, and I'm here to just like see what's going on and some other ideas.
I'm Kate. No affiliations, just here to learn about it.
I'm Greg. Part of the Socialist Party USA. Radical perspectives that are fundamentally different. No hard party affiliation, hard ideological identification as Maoist.
I'm Bill, and I've been a Marxist for a long, long time, and I've written a lot, and I've sort of been devoting myself in recent years to teaching and writing and trying to promote like a radical view of history particularly. I'm also director of the Institute of Working Class History, which is sort of a research group that sometimes sponsors conferences. We're now talking about having a conference in Norwich, England in February 2018, for example. So a lot of intellectual academic work, but you know, I've in the past have obviously been involved in the activist things as well, various groups and so forth.
And I'm Chris. I'm one of the people who initiated this campaign for a Socialist Party, and I'm also the founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is a separate project that's purely educational, as opposed to this project, which is more activist-oriented. And I've been a leftist since I was 13 and read the Communist Manifesto. And I read it because Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada, and I wanted to know why. And so a friend of mine said, read the Communist Manifesto, it will tell you why. And it's been downhill ever since. 1983, baby. All right, so let's get started on the topic for this evening. We've previously had Bill talk about the Debs tradition in American socialism and the Socialist Party of America at an event that occurred last year. And we've always had an intention to have Bill back to talk about a book that he edited of Wilhelm Liebknecht's writings, and to talk about the origins of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, through this figure, Wilhelm Liebknecht, one of the founders, one of Marx's first disciples, but one of the founders of the SPD. And to really talk about what it takes to get a socialist party started. What are the historical examples of that? I think our last discussion about the Socialist Party of America was more geared towards what the Socialist Party of America looked like at its height. And so we wanted this discussion to be rather what things look like earlier on in their beginnings. And specifically through the figure of one of the founders of the SPD, which was the SPD was the kind of model for the Socialist Party of America. and was already well established by the time Eugene Debs read Karl Kautsky's The Class Struggle when he was in prison, and left the Democrats and made history. So, welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming back. And so, I wanted to talk about this character, Wilhelm Liebknecht, and also specifically what the early socialist movement looked like in Germany that ended up making the Socialist Party of Germany happen.
Well, it's sort of interesting because, everybody sort of looks at the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, once it's a great success. But what they often don't look at is the origins. And the origins were just as chaotic and problematic as the sort of things that we go through. That is to say, originally, Liebknecht, for example, really wasn't even a German figure. He was really a figure among the people who were involved in the workers' movement in Saxony, which was only part of Germany. Right? He really didn't have a national presence at first. So this was something they had to keep working at. And one of the things they were very good at is they realized the importance, I think we mentioned this in passing before, of building institutions. So for example, in Germany, it was actually the socialists who started the trade unions, rather than, say, in Britain, where trade unions founded the Labor Party. So they understood you needed newspapers, you needed to get people in Parliament. Not so much, they weren't really thinking of passing laws, so much as just to be able to speak out the window, as they would say, to present their ideas and get them across to a wider audience. And so it was a lot of years of this sort of work, including a lot of years where Liebknecht spent in London in exile, being kicked out of the country. So I mean, it wasn't easy going. It took a long time and sort of followed the process of German industrialization and unification for them to achieve things. And there were a lot of conflicts. For example, from the get-go, Liebknecht and his co-thinker August Bebel had been in complete conflict with Ferdinand Lassalle and his group within in the left, which had
was a bigger group.
A much bigger group, and had a top-down approach to socialism.
Right, so how is it that they were in competition with Lassalle and with this much larger tendency in German socialism, and ended up working with them and forming the party? How did that come about? How did competition turn into cooperation?
Well, basically, the way they saw it, Marx was very critical of the Gotha program, of course, and the unification. But the way Liebknecht saw it was that once Lassalle had got himself killed in a silly duel over the honor of a female aristocrat, but anyhow, it's a very, very strange story we need to go into now.
It probably resonates with a lot of hipsters today.
Yeah, maybe they like Lassalle in that sense. The Lassallean movement, for all its faults, was a workers' movement, was a left movement, and without Lassalle, who was sort of like the guru of the whole thing, they saw that they could take these people and bring them together. Now, it was problematic. It wasn't always easy because on certain issues they had very different views. But, in other words, they had to be principled yet flexible at the same time. Now, that's easy to say, but it's very hard to do. Very hard to do, because when does principle turn into being dogmatic and a jerk? And when does flexible mean that you just support whatever seems to be a good idea? So it's not easy.
For context, besides unification, what are some broad differences that they had there?
Well, because industrialization was happening. Germany industrialized very rapidly. So all during this period, you have the urbanization and the industrialization of German society that's going on. The cities are growing dramatically at the same time. Marx made all sorts of predictions early on in the 1840s, all of which seem to be coming true in Germany. So it was rapid growth, a lot of schisms. Right? So, you had a situation where, the working class was completely sort of shut out in a lot of ways. They felt alienated from society. They weren't really part of it. Still had the old aristocrats hanging around, of course.
Where were they, where did socialism take hold? You mentioned Saxony. So could you describe, first of all, that region in Germany and the kind of milieu, the kind of places in Germany where they really established themselves to begin with?
Well, obviously it was urban areas. It really were important that they had urban areas. The German socialism was never particularly strong, given how strong it was, within like agricultural areas and rural areas so much. It was more of a urban philosophy, and it also sort of came out in terms of context of the 1848 revolutions, 1849 that had failed to unify Germany, failed to create a German republic. What Liebknecht himself said is that the German bourgeoisie didn't really have any nerve. So therefore, they basically surrendered a lot of the tasks of both nation building and fighting for a republic and democratic liberties. They'd sort of given them up in return for economic prosperity, in return for them being able to advance more. So they had the advantage, in a sense, that they got to be the sort of standard bearers of those sort of ideas, which had a wide popularity, particularly in urban areas, not just with the newly growing working class, but also with, you know, various other people. A lot of small artisan types, you know, a lot of small shopkeeper types were very interested in this because they were getting ground down by the big corporations that were growing up. So there was part of that as well.
So I wanted to say one thing about like that context also, which is to say that there was a socialist left that was initially fragmented but ultimately came together. But they were also not only competing with each other, but also competing with the liberals in Germany, the Progressive Party. And how did that play out?
Well, basically, the Progressive Party became their big competitors, but more and more, the Progressives just didn't, as you said, have any political nerve. They just didn't stand up for their principles. And by standing up for the principles, they won over even a big part of the people who originally had voted for the Progressives.
So could you give some examples of how the Progressives failed and the Socialists were able to take advantage?
Well, for example, there's various instances, but one, for example, Bismarck basically decides he's going to ignore Parliament and collect taxes anyhow. And what do the Progressives do? That's right, nothing. Right? They don't respond. Right? So for many people, the Socialist Party in Germany was able to sort of take on the banner of the Party of Progress in a broad sense. Right? Not just as specific representatives of a certain class, in the way that sort of the Labour Party got pigeonholed in England. I mean, it's sort of a broader context there, which had its downsides too by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, but it allowed them to become a big movement.
Yeah, most people forget in the context of the United States especially that the left originally was against taxes, at least for the working class, right? In other words, that it was the left that really stood opposed to the taxation of the working class and of the lower classes more generally. Whereas ever since the New Deal, left capitalism anyway is associated with higher taxes. I think it's still the case in Europe that the left is associated with an anti-tax sentiment. But in the United States, it's been hijacked by the right.
Right, and it also goes with one of the things that Liebknecht stressed: not a penny, not a man for the system. In other words, anti-militarism. Because part of the argument that they made, which was very much a direct pocketbook type argument, was, look, big military, somebody's going to pay for it. Who's going to pay for it? We are. Right? And I think that's
very apropos.
In the United States is very apropos.
Absolutely.
When you look at the figures about how much of our tax money goes directly into the military, half the budget.
Half the budget. Okay, so at the same time, there was a history of the socialists cooperating with the progressives sometimes. So how did that work in terms of how were they able to use that to their advantage?
Well, the thing was they were able to make themselves look reasonable and actually get some reforms passed. Because that was the thing. There was always a tension between this goal of socialism and actually doing something concrete. And this was a problem they always had, anybody's going to have, as a party like that. So they were able to cooperate with the progressives to actually get some concrete reforms so people didn't feel like they were just sort of like talking some sort of nice pipe dream, you know, in the future, that they actually could get things done.
Because one of the main controversies of the socialist movement around Marxism was the conflict with the anarchists over whether to engage in political activity at all.
Right.
In other words, whether to focus primarily on like social organizing, economic organizing, and to leave the political field to the bourgeoisie, to the capitalists, and to the liberals. I think that's still an issue that's with us, especially in terms of movementism, and the kind of division of labor that one sees usually between movementism and electoralism. That, in a sense, people sort of bracket the issue of electoral politics in order to carry out the movement, and then they end up voting for the liberals anyway. What's the case, and how did they win that argument against the anarchists, that political action, because Bakunin famously said that if you engage in political action, you're going to end up inevitably, structurally selling out to the bourgeoisie and to the liberals, that you'll just be a prop for the liberals. And yet there is this history of the opposite, where the socialists were able to replace the liberals. So how did that play out?
Well, I think a lot of ways what happened is because they were so successful at using the seats in opposition, like voting against the budgets and making all these great, stands, yet still trying to get some reforms passed, that they were able to sort of, for a long period of time, for at least for some years, sort of have their cake and eat it too, as the saying goes, where they were the party of principled opposition, yet they were the ones that didn't steal the city treasury when they were on the city council and things like that. Because you have to understand, the other thing that they offered people, which may be very applicable to the United States today, is that they were the most honest of all
the non-corrupt, right.
Right, that they were not corrupt like most of the other parties were. And that was something that they played a lot, which may see as not very ideological or not very important, but they would play up the fact that these other parties were corrupt and they weren't.
Which is hugely important in terms of getting popular support.
Exactly.
Right. It's something that, again, there's a great deal of cynicism nowadays on the left with respect to politics. That it's just assumed that as soon as you have any kind of access to power, you're a sellout, or you have to, in a sense, accept the reigning corruption.
What does it mean, however, to be part of a party in the 1870s? Because the parliament didn't have any legislative power.
They did have power, though. They had the power of the purse. They still had that power.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right? In other words, the capitalists gave up a lot of political rights, but they still demanded power of the purse over the government.
But you can make that same argument about the United States.
That's right.
How much power does Congress have when whoever's president can just decide to go start a war somewhere?
That's right. Exactly.
It's more pitched on the level of they're not looking at taking power within the next 10 to 15 years, i.e. it's not like they're going to be like tomorrow passing legislation or...
No, the idea is they're presenting an idea. Liebknecht has an interesting essay where he compares socialism to Islam. And his argument, socialism to Islam, and his argument is that Islam, which was widely accepted as the Islamic empires like the Ottoman Empire were all in decay and falling apart in the late 19th century, and his argument was this happened because they gave up the original sort of devotion to the idea. Once they gave up the idea of really Islam being the most important thing, then Islam fell into corruption and splintering. However, if socialists gave up the idea, they would be the same way. So that's why you had to always stress the idea of sticking with socialism as a principle. And linked with that, and this was one of the institutional things they did, was his famous essay, Knowledge is Power, is that they would have socialist schools and they'd set up workers' libraries. And these workers' libraries would, of course, have Marx, but Marx wasn't checked out nearly as much as things on, like, how to fix your, stove or something. Crackling novels. But the thing is, we take libraries for granted. The fact is, one of the things that kept workers, even if they were literate, from advancing themselves was that books were so expensive and there weren't public libraries in most of Germany. So by setting up these libraries, that was a way of pulling people in very concretely. Come to our library, we'll loan you free books. But on the other hand, you're developing them, this attachment. They created a whole alternative universe. They had singing societies, right? So for example, you had this irony that the same night in Berlin that there'd be a meeting like this with beer being served, There'd be another meeting, another part of town, which would be the Socialist Temperance Society, where people had a drinking problem and wanted to stay off alcohol. The point being, it didn't matter whether you wanted to drink or didn't want to drink. You joined the socialist universe.
That's right. Yep.
I guess I'm curious with respect to the libraries example.
Because Ed's a librarian.
Oh, okay. There we go.
I looked a little bit into the history, and I found this interesting because in the United States, as I understand it, especially in the late 19th century, like the rest of it, we see this rollout of public libraries. And from a political perspective, from the perspective of the Socialist Party, this had to be seen as some kind of potential competition in a sense. So how did the party react when they were organizing societies in ways that then were kind of like replicated or...
They took credit for it.
Right.
They said, because of what we've done, they're forced to do it. Same thing like Bismarck's Social Security provisions, workman's comp, et cetera, very minuscule, but still something. They said, well, it's only because of us that he was forced to do that. If it hadn't been for us, we would have gotten nothing.
That's right.
That was always their argument. Anything they give you is because we're standing up to them. If we don't stand up to them, we'll get nothing.
Which is true. But again, so the alternative universe that you're talking about, but it wasn't a sect in the sense that it was open to people who were not just members of the Socialist Party.
Right. In fact, most people who participate in these societies, whether it was a singing society or there was like a socialist innkeeper's journal for people who had bed and breakfasts and so on. Most of the people, Socialist Bicycle Society, they organize trips out in the
That would work with hipsters too.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but they would just organize these trips. I mean, think about it now. You have people organize, like the naked bike thing, I think is tonight, tomorrow night. You have people organize these things just for the hell of it. Well, the point is you could organize things like a socialist bike ride, right? Wear red or whatever, or I don't know, wear purple. Green. I don't know what color you use in the United States since they've even co-opted the colors, right? But in any case, you would have that and people would come to ride the bike and most of them wouldn't be socialists, right? But you'd get them sort of into the milieu, right? What in psychology they call milieu therapy, right?
Absolutely.
Try to get them in there and get them talking about these ideas and talking to people who are socialists and thinking about them and so on. And that was the great advantage. For every person who was actually a dues-paying member of the SPD, there were like 10 or 20 who were in one of these sort of mass organizations. I mean, they weren't secretive. It wasn't like tricking people. I mean, it said Socialist Bicycle Society or whatever. But, you know, it brought them in because it gave them something to do. So even the drinking societies, for example, you know, some people lamented that most people who came to these various meetings that were considered socialist socials just came because there was a Socialist Party guy who owned the bar or something. They had a beer special. You know, it was just like, well, cheap beer, I'll go. You know? But still, they wanted
because
to
it wasn't just propaganda, was it?
No,
it was that in many respects the Socialist Party organized liberal society, organized civil society.
Exactly.
And so that became associated with the politics of socialism. In other words, they weren't, certainly they were trying to propagandize among the people, but it's not like that was the price of entry or something.
No, no. No, it wasn't like we talked about sect. Like the Catholic Church, we could say the Spartacist League, but we'll stick with the Catholic Church. You know, a sect, you know, you've got to sort of buy onto this theology. You've got to sign up. You've got to go through confirmation classes, you know, whatever it might be. Whereas with this, it was much more amorphous, you know, which has its problems later on, but you know, much more amorphous, bringing people in. You didn't have to sign your life away. You didn't have to swear anything. You know, you just sort of came to these various events and got talking to people, and they really organized a lot of things.
And it also, you mentioned it before, like it was for the drinkers and for the non-drinkers. In other words, it wasn't associated with a specific lifestyle or a specific like taste community or subculture. That it embraced different, antithetical kind of subcultures.
I was going to say in that sense it's probably more comparable to the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church organized society. You know, the Catholic Church has both drinking and anti-drinking events. It's not like Protestantism where there's like sort of specific lifestyles that you have to join or something like that. Like there's an organization of society.
That's because you're from Mexico.
Yeah. No,
I was gonna say-
that's what I'm thinking.
I'd say you got familiar with German Protestantism. I mean,
Right.
it can be pretty much the same thing.
Or
Absolutely.
Italy or so.
Right. In other words, that socialism has always been accused of being a religion. But the question is that political success is actually predicated on not being a religion. In other words, being more than a religion,
Right.
or not really being a religion, being less than a religion in that sense. Whereas we associate the left now, especially with certainly certain subcultures, communities of interest, not just ideologies,
With how?
but also just that you don't look like a suburbanite, right? That the left means that you no longer dress the way you did when you lived in the suburbs, right?
Well, like for example, this whole thing about vegetarianism or veganism. If there was a real socialist movement, you would have like vegan nights, right, for the socialists. At the same time, you'd have steak dinners at another restaurant across town or whatever, because you wouldn't make that like a dividing
Exclusive,
line politically, right? You wouldn't say, well, we won't take anyone who eats meat in our party.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about again, Liebknecht as a figure, he and Babel really did the organizing to sort of lay the groundwork. You mentioned that he spent a lot of time in exile in the UK because of the criminalization of socialism early on. But how did the Socialist Party in Germany organize at first, especially under conditions of illegality? How did that happen?
Well, basically they organized underground. You have to remember, you shouldn't conflate fascism with
Right.
repression in Imperial Germany.
Right.
It wasn't fascism.
Right.
So what they would have is they have what they call trusted men. These people would be in the factories in the community, and they'd be basically secret members of the Socialist Party when you weren't supposed to be in the Socialist Party, supposed to be outlawed. And then they would basically continue with a lot of their mass work. And there would always be a policeman. It was regulation. If you had a meeting, you had to have a policeman, anything political. So they'd form these groups. They'd call it like workers, one I liked was Workers Bird Watching Society. So a guy would get up and start talking about various birds. And if the policeman had been staying awake at all and been paying attention, he'd realize that these birds were not real birds. They were not acting like real. It was like completely, Aesopian language. Talking about, these horrible birds, that come in and steal the eggs of the other birds, so on and so forth. But typically the police didn't catch on. They'd be able to have their meetings and their discussions. And the police would, say, well, yeah, they were talking about birds. I don't know. So they did things that you couldn't have done under fascism. They just would have figured, oh, you're probably socialist.
They would have figured it out.
Yeah, they would have. Well, they would have thrown you in a camp. Anyhow. Just on the principle that. Why are you talking about birds? There must be something.
So you mentioned that they occupy the place after the failure of the Revolution of 1848 that liberals would occupy elsewhere. But this also takes place in other countries that are more liberal. In other words, it also takes place in France, in the UK, in the United States, that socialists do this civil society kind of work, as well as standing up for the things that the liberals sacrifice in practice. So you mentioned like the socialist innkeepers, right, and the artisans and sort of small proprietors. So what was the appeal there? How did the socialists make an appeal at the level of the middle class?
Oh, they told the middle class that you're being destroyed by big business, and on the one hand by the Junkers, the old feudal lords on the other, right? Which was very realistic and very, very clear to them. They could make that case very easily that you guys are being destroyed. Okay, you're not workers, you own your own business, but who's controlling you? Who's passing these laws that are restricting you? Who's constantly on your back? Who's controlling the police who are coming in and harassing you? All those sort of things. So they had that sort of vague anti-establishment, but very principled anti-establishment thing to appeal directly to the middle-class small business people that, you're getting screwed by increased monopolization and so on and so forth, which already is taking place in the United States, and we already have the monopolies. And when they first started talking about it, people thought, well, no, there will always be a lot of small businesses and so on. And then over time, of course, that turned out not to be the case.
So, just to jump a little bit, because I think that any attempt to organize socialist politics in the United States today immediately comes up against competition with the Democratic Party. And one of the things that's been commented on about the neoliberal Democratic Party is the so-called hourglass figure that the Democrats form, namely that they have the support of liberal elites and of poor people. But what's missing from that hourglass characterization of the Democratic Party is the appeal among the middle class, especially the professional middle class. And so what's the track record in the history of socialism, not only with the old middle classes that were threatened by the state and threatened by onerous kind of finance capital exploitation at that level. But what about the appeal to the new middle class, the middle class that we have today that forms a kind of solid base for the Democratic Party?
Well, they had basically, problems, of course, with emerging middle class, because some of them thought, I've arrived and all that. But what they kind of put themselves forward as, is the party of progress. Right? And it's hard to understand now, after all these various things that have happened in the last, 100 years, 50 years, whatever, even 10 years, 5 years, last month, that people believed at the time very much in this idea of progress. And it was very easy to sell people the idea that, look, you're newly middle class, you're for progress, you're trying to move forward. What's holding you back is these old institutions like the monarchy, the feudal lords, and also these monopolies, who of course are anti-progressive, or anti-progress, anti-moving forward. Now, progress and the word progressive, and of course in the United States, don't really mean very much, because people throw them around sort of without any sort of meaning whatsoever. But they said that, we are really the ones who want to move everyone forward. And that, to at least some people, had a certain appeal.
I mean, if I could sort of follow up on that. So you say that, like, today in the United States, everyone claims to be progressive in that respect. And yet, right, they still have to compete for the mantle of progress.
Right.
In other words, even someone like Trump has to pretend that he's for progress.
Right.
So how would that play out? What are the precedents from the socialist movement of being able to compete over? Because even Kaiser Wilhelm II claimed to be progressive.
Oh,
right.
Of
And certainly Bismarck thought of himself not just as a Junker, but as a progressive in the sense of.
Well, in a sense, he was a unified Germany. You could make that argument.
Absolutely.
That he was progressive.
And so, how did socialists successfully compete over that desire for progress that has such popular appeal?
Well, they fought over the definition of progress. So they argued that, for example, large military, standing army, big expenditures, inherited privilege, right, the whole structures and hierarchy of power and wealth, that all those things hold progress back. And that we want to unleash progress by putting more money into education, putting more money into scientific research, etc., which are all sort of platitudes in a way, but I mean it was a different definition of progress they were really trying to give. And I think that was important. That they said progress is not judged by how many people you have in your army or how big the middle class is in the material sense. Progress is how much you've advanced society. So they would point to people in a literary sense, of course Goethe or Schiller, in a scientific sense, of course Humboldt, people like that, and say, well, that's what we mean by progress. We want to go forward. If people haven't read that book that came out about Humboldt, The Invention of Nature, it's quite interesting making the argument that Humboldt was one of the first people to see nature as a sort of a whole, not just like separate. You can sort of develop the whole idea of ecology and so on. Why I say that is that had a big influence on German socialists. I mean, they looked to him as a good example, something to point to.
As a kind of an Enlightenment figure.
Yep,
As an
exactly.
Enlightenment figure.
Even Frederick the Great, they could claim sometimes an Enlightenment figure. You know, so, for example, the socialists, I think it was Liebknecht, maybe it was Babel, one time quoted Frederick the Great's famous saying that if Muslims and pagans were willing to move to my realm and therefore increase the population, the prosperity, I'd build temples and mosques for them. You know, they made that argument in terms like against religious bigotry or anything like that, against anti-Semitism specifically.
Right, so in the U.S. today, you know, one of the things that you see also with the Democrats is that they get to pose as pro-science, right? You know, so policy tends to be seen as enlightened and scientific. You know, the Paris Accords on climate change is seen as scientific, as progressive in that respect. And so how do you compete with that? I mean, I know that the NASA scientist, what's his name, who back in the 80s sort of put the climate change, the temperature increase on the map, he actually dismissed the Paris Accords as complete bullshit and as just window dressing and not accomplishing anything. And he was a government scientist. Right. He was a government scientist in a conservative era in the 1980s. And so, you know, how do you make that argument when, again, the Democrats seem to be associated with higher education, with the new professional middle classes, and therefore can claim the mantle of science in that respect, especially in a technocratic sense? Like, how did that look in the early socialist movement? Because certainly there were a lot of people who would claim the Enlightenment who were not socialists. Right. That you know, in the kind of ambient milieu that socialists operated in. How did they pose that question of social progress, but also enlightenment, right? The mantle of enlightenment. How did they successfully overcome the liberals claiming that?
Basically, they said the liberals were for the Enlightenment only for their own class, and that the socialists were the Enlightenment of the whole society. So they always tied it with mass public education. And their argument was that, well, if we can produce so many great figures just from a small educated class, imagine how many great figures we could produce if we educated everyone. You know, they made that sort of argument, a democratic argument, which on the one hand appealed to the common people who were their voting base, but on the other hand, you know, was a very logical argument to make sort of, you know,
to the broader society.
Yeah, the broader society. So they push that. Now it's hard with the Democratic Party, of course, but on the other hand,
the party of education.
Yes, the Democratic Party of education. But you know, you see how weak, actually, how brittle the Democratic Party's hold is by the fact. Let's look at Bernie Sanders just for a second as an aside. I mean, here's this rather eccentric lone wolf guy. Goes off to a not very important state, frankly, right? Manages to build up Vermont, builds up a political career, gets in the Senate, claims being independent, although he talks with the Democrats, doesn't have anything to do with any of the major power structures, is often introducing bills for like universal health care or something like that just get ignored. Yeah, doesn't seem very important. And he, out of the blue, steps into the Democratic Party, where they could perfectly reasonably say, hey, wait a second, you're not a Democrat. You know, you're an independent. What are you doing here? But you know, he just steps in, right? And look at the run he gave the Democratic establishment, right? Now, we could say, well, let's say what's wrong with Bernie Sanders, but I mean, to the average person, he was a socialist,
right?
And when they went in the ballot box, oh, here's Hillary, that's neoliberalism, and here's Bernie Sanders, that's the socialist. Oh, I'll vote for the socialist. And millions of people did. So I think that their hold is very tenuous, right? I mean, I think they have like the higher echelons. So I'm speaking about my own union, the American Federation of Teachers. The president of the union like endorsed Hillary without asking anyone very early on, et cetera, et cetera. And I heard from a friend of mine who was a vice president of the union that he heard it was because she was offered, you know, Department of Education in return. That was the deal that was being brokered. But the fact was, I also heard that probably the majority of people who worked for the AFT in their offices, paid staff members, were actually voting for Sanders, although they couldn't say anything.
Right.
Because they knew Hillary was just bullshit and be more of the same. Right? So I think their hold isn't really that deep in a way.
That raises an interesting question. In the opening statement, I made mention of Sanders only because last year Sanders was such a prominent phenomenon. One of the things that's remarkable about this is that there were kind of two different Sanders supporters, two types of Sanders supporters. The Sanders supporters who wanted something completely different, and the Sanders supporters who wanted him to be Hillary, except trustworthy, right? Except honest. Right? Principled, right? And so how do you deal with that? In other words, that kind of mixed quality of people whose only problem with the liberals is that they seem to sell out, that they're corrupt, but otherwise on principle essentially support that framework of politics, and are therefore not really particularly amenable to socialism.
Well, I think those are the people, at least from the Wilhelm Liebknecht example, that you have to educate or try to educate. You're not going to convince all of them that it's not that these people are otherwise good people, but then somehow get corrupt personally. It's a logic of their politics. That it logically comes out of their politics. And explain why that is. Why does it logically come out of their politics? Why is corruption so inevitable for those people?
Not a moral failing.
Not a moral failing.
Not an
individual failing. It's really institutionalized.
That's right. Because I think these are the kinds of things that we face that seem to be, it seemed, pardon me, that if you go back to the 19th century, because everything is so new, it seems like this clear open field in comparison to what we face today. And yet a lot of the same obstacles were there then, too. And so, we tend to be so discouraged by the specter of history, by several generations of examples of people trying to break with the system, but inevitably giving in to the logic of it. Is it only because the system wasn't well established back then that they were more successful, or is there something that they were doing that we're missing?
Well, I think, first of all, the system wasn't as well established, so that makes it much more difficult in a country like the United States as a sort of track record of this sort of thing. But I also think part of the problem is that the Socialist Party in Germany was able to promote the idea of solidarity and collective action and sort of the whole idea that you can't just do things as an individual, where in the United States, a lot of times socialists are afraid to take on the whole ideology of individualism, right? That whole sort of idea that, well, whether I fail or don't fail or succeed, it's all up to me. There's nothing to do with the system, how hard I work, etc., etc. And they don't want to tackle that because it's too dicey. And I think that's something, a cultural change.
How significant was working class support for the system in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s? How likely was a worker to be actually pro-Bismarck? And how did the socialists respond?
Well, it depends. Sometimes some workers would be pro-Bismarck, but it is always different, fractions within the working class. If you're a Catholic and you're a worker, you probably weren't pro-Bismarck.
Right.
Because Bismarck persecuted the Catholic Church, right?
The culture comes.
The culture comes, exactly. So that was a whole group that wasn't. And then within the Protestant non-Catholic working class, there were some people who didn't like Bismarck because they didn't like him because he was a Prussian. That was true of a lot of Saxons, for example. So that sort of regionalism, which, by the way, isn't that totally different from the United States? There's some people who vote Democratic on the idea that they're the party of the North now these days. And other people,
ironically enough,
and that other people vote Republican because they ironically see it as the party of the South. So there's different, frictions there. But you have to always constantly be going after and sort of trying to explain to people why, there's a better way.
About individualism, in terms of solidarity, right? It's not just an ethos, though, is it? Like, in other words, it's a matter of organization.
Yeah.
So the United States has, maybe always had this individualist ethos, and yet what we're facing today is not really individualism, but atomization, which is different. Right. In other words, there's something about post World War II society in particular that can be confused for individualism without really being individualism. And so certainly the old Socialist Party didn't have any problem dealing with kind of American individualism. And again, a certain kind of individualism certainly would have appealed to people who would otherwise be liberals in a place like Germany back in the 19th century. And so how did the socialists make an appeal to that kind of liberal individualism and lead it in the direction of social solidarity?
Well, they made the argument if you don't have solidarity, if you don't have unity, you won't really be able to have the freedom to be an individual. You'll be crushed by the big powers, right? The monopolies, the Junkers, and so on and so forth. And that was much more convincing. At least at the time, they were very successful in getting a lot of people to think that. Maybe it'd be harder now, I don't know. But that's why they were more successful in cities than they were in the countryside. Because people who had their own farms were much more sort of rooted to an individual ethos in a lot of ways. It was harder for them, in farm areas. In rural areas, they had a much, much harder time getting support.
Did that have to do with the smallholding? Did it have to do with the village mentality? What was that?
Yes, all of those things.
Okay, so...
Yeah. No, seriously,
Right.
I mean, it was all those sort of things. And it was also the rural-urban split. That is to say, socialism was seen as an urban phenomena in many rural areas, and therefore there was sort of an immediate reaction to it. And here come the guys from the city trying to sell us something else, right? Trying to manipulate us or trying to use us or whatever. Now, it's not like they had no success in the countryside. I don't want to overplay it, but I just meant proportionally they were much more successful in urban areas.
So look,
Something like, I'm sorry, just
go ahead.
something like boom towns, like sort of mining towns. Like it seems like the American Socialist Party had like a lot of success in like places where you couldn't even really be established.
Yeah, like Butte, Montana.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the same thing in Germany. When you'd have these rapidly expanding, factory towns or mining towns in the rural or whatever.
It just really seems like even better than like an urban environment.
You mean like newly proletarianized?
Newly proletarianized.
Right.
People are going from the countryside into these like new settlements.
Because this is another specter that I think haunts like the history of Marxism, is that you could say, okay, where was Marxism and really socialism as a mainstream political movement most successful? It seems to have been most successful in relatively backwards and kind of crash industrialized areas like Germany and Russia, as opposed to the older capitalist countries that had experienced that crash kind of proletarianization, but much earlier, like in a different epoch. And so it looks like, the older history, the success of socialists was tied to really kind of contingent phenomena. So what about the fact that, we're talking about the United States and kind of a post-industrial country. What are the prospects there if it's not a sociological phenomenon of new proletarianization exclusively?
But it depends what you mean by proletarianization, too. I mean, you have the fact that, like, for example, you have these millions of tech slaves now, right? Now, that's a new expanding industry. Now, maybe it's not your traditional blue-collar proletariat, but it's the same sort of thing. These people work for huge companies. They're
relocated.
They're free to relocate, right? They're free to have short-term contracts, et cetera, et cetera. No, I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got a lot of the classic problems that lead people to question the system among, a lot of these workers. So that would be a perfect example of, again, a new industry. As a new industry comes up, once an industry's been established long enough, then, usually the rulers have had some way, the, owners, whatever,
some modus vivendi.
Yeah,
with
some
the
way of
workers.
trying to control it. Or
The place where that was coming is exactly that, like new industry, like in the first 3 or 4 years of the textile industry in in well, I studied Mexican history, so like in the Gulf of Mexico, there was like in 10-15 years, all these boomtowns, textile factories started happening in Veracruz. And the IWW had like success there, and like created organizations that lasted into the 30s when everything was defeated pretty much, but like that lasted into the 1920s.
Lasted a generation. Lasted a generation.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what we're really talking about too, because maybe that's another point to bring up with Liebknecht and Babel, is that it took a generation. But within a generation, they went from zero to taking power, at least potentially. In other words, like in 40 years.
Yeah.
Basically 1870s to 1910s, they started from very little and were able to build it to the point of almost taking power. And so could you say something about that in terms of like how we think about organizing, party building, the kind of rhythm, the tempo of that?
Well, I think sometimes we think of it as sort of like building a wall. You just put these bricks and slow and slow and slow. It doesn't work like that. It's really quantity turns into quality, as they say. And basically, at first it just seemed like, these people weren't going anywhere. Bismarck had crushed them. They're all exiles. Most of the leadership is kicking around London or Zurich, various places. They're underground. They're marginal. They have some people in the parliament who've run as independents. But, it kind of looks like, their moment is gone, right? And they've lost. But in fact, they come back, and very, very quickly, right? The pressure finally is enough that Wilhelm II has the anti-socialist laws repealed, and the party mushrooms. From 1878 to like 1900, 12 years, or 22 years, it just goes from sort of zero to being the largest, potential institution in the whole society. Right? So
not just the largest political party in terms of votes, but the largest institution in society.
Right.
And that's
having many things. Having control of the major trade unions, having all these civil society organizations, and they really, really managed to do that.
So it's the perseverance of the first generation, or what is it?
Yeah, the perseverance of the first generation, and sometimes, you just make that breakthrough. It's sort of like rather than building a wall, it's like breaking a wall. It's like, you keep hammering, and at a certain point,
it gives way.
It gives way, and the whole thing comes tumbling, at least, in part.
Because I think that's one of the things that we're talking about in terms of the left today tends to have a pretty narrow horizon. In other words, tends to have maybe at best a kind of 10-year kind of window mentality, and otherwise gives up.
Yeah.
Right. And there are a few examples of that: the 30s to the 40s, the 70s to the 80s, of the beginnings of a breakthrough into mainstream politics that then collapses and disperses pretty quickly. And so, how does this earlier history point to overcoming that problem?
Well, I think that's also the importance of building institutions, because if people are sort of isolated or atomized, it's very easy to give way to demoralization. But the thing is, they had this sort of social solidarity, so maybe the party's outlawed, but you could still go and meet with these sort of apolitical groups and meet people and sort of keep your morale up. And I think that's important. I think that's one of the things that most left groups haven't done. They've just basically concentrated on, we're going to seize power in 10 years, or we're going to do this or that. And then what doesn't happen, there's nothing to fall back on, because they've thrown all their sort of emotional eggs into the basket of like one political project and ignored everything else.
Can you talk more about like some of this like kind of society building that the Socialist Party did? Like I'm wondering the Socialist Party today can do in the absence of running aldermen or running policy, the services that they provided.
Well, just imagine that any sort of activity that people want to engage in, that you can think of sort of all these different community groups, and you have hazard groups doing it. Well, you could do those sort of things, whether it was those bike races we talked about, or whether it was some sort of after-school program. right? I mean, just imagine we had that. Give a contemporary example. The Socialist Party of the Netherlands does something very interesting. Is they have, even though they have what we consider a great health system, they have their whole health service. They have several doctors that work for the party. They're on salary, and people go to see them for like second opinions and everything else. And so they, build up this huge presence in society through, having like mobile health clinics go around and sort of show up the deficiencies of the established health system.
Right, so winning over professionals to socialism, so that you have professionals who are providing services to the people. Right, on basically supported by the movement.
Exactly. For example, think of how many people have like a hell of a time getting through all their tax forms, right? If they've got jobs. I mean, imagine if, for example, you had free tax service, right? I mean, which isn't that? I mean, really, wouldn't that be that hard to organize when you think about it? You just need a couple of accountants that know something about that.
Or legal advocacy.
Legal advocacy.
Because that's something that I know that they did a great deal of in Germany.
Yes, absolutely.
That they had a lot of lawyers who took up cases on the part of the working class and also on the part of liberal causes. So,
I gotta head out. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Nice to meet you.
I know that Wilhelm Liebknecht's son, Karl Liebknecht, who had a very famous career later as a communist, he was a lawyer who worked in the youth section of the Socialist Party of Germany and ended up doing a lot of cases vis-a-vis conscripts and military service. And so did a lot of advocacy for the rights of soldiers in the military, for example.
And to give you an example of Karl Liebknecht's youth work, though, for example, you have this problem. Parents work and they have these kids, right? And they want to get rid of these kids for at least part of the time. So, even if they're not religious, they often send them to religious vacation Bible schools in the summer and so on, because they want to get rid of the kids, right? They want free babysitting, right? Well, that's something in Germany that Karl Liebknecht was organizing, is that instead of having these militaristic groups take the kids, they would take the kids, the socialists, and take them out camping and, sort of have that equivalent. Because he came to the United States in 1910. He was horrified because he saw a Boy Scout parade. And he couldn't imagine how horrible this was, that all these children were dressed up like soldiers and marching in lines. He just thought this was like, unthinkable. And he said, that's what they want to do to us too, and we have to fight this, right? So, again, you'd have, basically socialist summer camps type ideas.
Right. This is the point that I wanted to make. Advocacy. Just to bring it back around to what we discussed earlier, in terms of socialists taking up like what would be seen as liberal causes. So you mentioned organizations. So what are some other examples of organizations? I know that, I studied the Communist Party of Iran as like a college project. And I know that, for instance, they had a huge women's organization. What's the history with respect to those kinds of things that we associate with leftism today?
Well, they did the same thing, because women weren't even allowed to vote. Not only were they not allowed to vote, they were not allowed during most of Imperial Germany to attend political meetings.
Oh.
Right? I mean, this
so
was
sex segregated.
Sex segregated in terms of they weren't supposed to vote, but they also weren't supposed to attend political meetings. Well, the social democracy, the German socialists, they fought against this, had their own women's organizations that were, very successful in a women's newspaper called Equality, not surprisingly, and so on. Same thing with youth, women, try to, advance all these things. So, for instance,
reach out to marginalized people.
To more people. One of the things that, people forget is one of the first things the socialists won when the German Revolution, they're trying to fight off the more radical people, is that women got to vote in the Weimar Republic.
Yep.
Right? Yep. In fact, when Hitler was coming to power, Germany was about to become the first major country to legalize all sexual activity between consenting adults. It had already passed out of committee, and they had a majority of votes in the Reichstag, and then 1929, it was 1929, the American stock market collapsed, and like nobody had time for social issues. It was thrown into a panic. But we forget that those sort of things. So, for example, August Bebel, at a time when it was incredibly unpopular, 1860s, I believe, he signed a public petition in favor of gay rights. This was a time when it was a felony in Germany to be a male homosexual. Many of the German states, for some reason, didn't think there were female homosexuals. So very odd. But in any case,
it's very Victorian.
Yeah, very Victorian. But in any case, he'd signed this. This was a public petition, and people asked him, "Well, what does this have to do
with socialism?
With socialism, organizing working class?" And he said, "Every demand that is for human liberation is a demand of socialism." Right? And Liebknecht totally supported him, although he kind of hesitated. He didn't put his name on it. You might want to know. He had some excuse. I forget what it was. No, because this was very unpopular. It's kind of hard to for us to even imagine. But this was just beyond the pale. This would probably be equivalent in it. It's not a good comparison. Probably equivalent like somebody, signing a petition in favor of ISIS or something. Saying, well, what's wrong with terrorism? It was just so
morally
unpopular.
reprehensible.
Yeah.
Although there was an earlier, history to the socialist movement with like utopian socialism.
Oh, absolutely.
That was for sexual liberation, but it was a very kind of subcultural bohemian kind of tendency. So the SPD brought it into the mainstream.
But being popular, to do it publicly,
right,
and to make it, to popularize it, that was really different.
Right. And they were able to do that.
Right.
So let's open it up a bit to not just individual questions, but to more general discussion. The kinds of questions that are raised by considering this kind of history.
I guess I want to raise the issue that I mentioned in the introduction, party base. Because I've had conversations for many years now with friends on the left. One is traces this lineage to the left-wing Communist Party is Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, and the other recently joined the left caucus of the DSM. And if I were to talk with them about the prospects of a mass socialist party in the future, they would basically say that you shouldn't join or try to build such a party until you have a base. And in the case of the former, the base would be perhaps community organizing, social movements. In the case of the latter, it would be the existing labor movement like the AFT, seminaries, and perhaps something. But they both agree on this point, and that you shouldn't try to bring about a mass party until you have a base. And I guess the basic lesson that I take from this conversation so far is really the task is not to tail after the base. The task is to build the base, to organize.
To organize the base is already there objectively. In other words, you could make the argument, and leftists in Europe, not just Liebknecht, but a lot of them made the argument, well, our base is there, right? We just have to go out there and organize it. It's, as Marx said, working class, a class in itself, but not for itself. And I think there are people out there, you have a base for this project of yours in itself. There's a base, but it's not for itself, and they haven't realized it yet.
Right, because I think that the example that you raised early on in the discussion, which is that the socialists built the labor movement in Germany, and that's true not only in Germany but also elsewhere. Whereas now we would sort of turn it around and say, well, you need to go to the existing labor movement and try to do some cadre building there for socialism. Whereas, they started with the cadre and produced the movement.
Right.
Right. So, there is that kind of paradox that we're faced with, which is to say, what you're describing, Ed, as base building, right? That it seems like we're always trying to build a base that never really gets built, right? At least in the last 40 years, right?
Yeah.
That's been the orientation. Whereas the earlier history, it would be the kind of counterexample of the political party being the way that you build the base, as opposed to waiting for the base, as if then the party will be formed when it's ready, when the base is ready.
Right. It'll just sort of jump into existence somehow.
Right.
And there's not a lot of evidence that happened.
Right.
I had these same kind of thoughts when we were talking about the kind of cultural activities, like what you would call civic society, or civil society, being used for political ends. And today it seems like much of the left, as we said, is involved in these cultural kind of,
activities, yeah.
Whatever we could call it, and then somehow it never ends up producing any sort of politics. And so, first of all, how was that?
Or it produces the politics of the Democratic Party.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yes, that's true. So how has that been reversed, and what distinguished kind of German? Because I think to say that they went hiking and someone happened to be talking about the Socialist Party, well, I mean, you need a little bit more than that. Or
Right.
what makes that kind of coherent to even if it's 1 out of 20 people ended up supporting socialist politics, being more involved, etc.
I think that what Bill said about institution building, in other words, that it's not just activity, but it's institution building.
And staying independent.
Right.
So, like, for example, let's say you see a problem where you live, and, I don't know, just make it up, more kids need after-school programs. Now, there's one or two ways of going about this, right? You can go to your alderman who's a member of the Democratic Party and say you want to work with him or her to get after-school programs for the kids, or you could independently set up after-school programs for the kids. See, most of what we see on the left today is going to a, quote, progressive alderman and trying to convince them to help out with this or that, project they're interested in. It's not independent. So that's the thing, but you need an independent political focus. So you're not just hiking. You're not happen to be hiking the guy's a socialist. You're hiking knowing it's a socialist organization.
Right. Because my own sense, because this is something that like C. Wright Mills mentioned a long time ago in the 50s, is that there's a whole layer of social organization that is just missing. That there's a collapse of the old liberal civil society organizations for a long time now, and one could even say that the labor movement isn't what it used to be either.
God, no.
Right? And that we've naturalized that. In other words, we just assume that absence of that kind of mediating layer of social organization that was once, again, in the context of the SPD, it was like associated with the Socialist Party. It didn't mean that it just was the Socialist Party, but it was associated with it, which was enough, right? Whereas, in the United States, one of the reasons why in our founding statement we say that what we're trying to do is unprecedented, is that the political parties in the United States don't really try to do that. Right? In other words, they sort of basically vie for the support of existing civil society organizations that they themselves are not responsible for. So, for instance, the Republicans lean on the evangelicals. But the evangelicals were not produced by the Republican Party. And in fact, in the New Deal era, the evangelicals were pro-Democratic Party. Right? So it's a fairly late phenomenon that they switched party allegiance because they're not really associated with the political stand of any kind. And so that kind of political organizing, which in the Cold War era, there were all sorts of liberal anxieties about this, that maybe the SPD really was like the template for the totalitarian Communist Party because it did do all this organizing, and so maybe it was, I think that Friedrich Hayek even said that it was the model for fascism, right? Because the fascists have their singing groups and their camping groups and whatever, and so there is a way in which we just take for granted that political parties are just groups of lawyers who run around from one corporation to another and figure out what to lobby for in terms of legislation, and that society just exists out there, and then there are these lawyers who run around serving this function and then occasionally run for office, and that's what politics is. Without thinking about like actual political parties. because even the Labour Party, since today is the day of the UK election, the Labour Party certainly was anti-socialist in the sense that we're talking about socialism, and yet because it was the party of the Trade Unions Congress, it's a different kind of party than like the Democratic Party. It's actually a much more like it depends for its money on the trade unions in a way the Democrats don't, of course. And so that kind of political, or even the SPD today in Germany, still is much more of a political party than anything that you have in the United States, right? And so, but again, there's a way in which we don't even know what a political party really is anymore. Or maybe we never have really known what it is in the United States, the way in Western Europe you have different kinds of examples of this.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, we kind of think of political parties, sort of like you decide you're going to go into politics, you go to law school, get a law degree, and then you decide, should I be a Republican or Democrat? Which would make more sense? If I'm a Republican, I got to go talk to these evangelicals who are white and racist. But if I'm a Democrat, I got to talk to these like very religious African American people. Which one would I rather do? Should I need the endorsement of the NAACP, or do I want the endorsement of David Duke and the Klan?
Or do you want the endorsement of Google or of Exxon?
Yeah, right.
Right? Like which corporation do you prefer?
Right. Do I go for Amazon and get the endorsement of the Washington Post in return? Right. Oh, we have to not tax e-commerce, right? And the Washington Post says, great candidate, very reasonable, right? Or do I want to start foaming about immigrants and get Fox on my side,
Other thoughts that provoked by this discussion?
I just want to say that this idea of having like once a month some sort of little gathering, semi-discussion, semi-social is really a good one, and very much in line with what I was talking about, that the German socialists did.
Well, certainly this Socialist Salon that we're trying to establish here with the Campaign for a Socialist Party, I would love it to be the place that everybody on the left in Chicago feels like they have to come to every month, because it's the place to be. It's where the discussion is going to be happening. It's where the activists are going to be meeting. It's where the academics who have some knowledge to share are going to be sharing that. That's certainly my aspiration for this anyway. Well, not the Jacobin Reading Group. Or in addition to the Jacobin Reading Group. In addition to the Jacobin Reading Group.
Well, it's separate because, study groups are study groups, right? I mean, that's what they are. But this would be something far different than a study group, right?
Especially because we're really trying to do is program like local activists and to try to draw connections among people who are otherwise just carrying on separately from each other, and to sort of put them in touch with each other through this kind of milieu.
How about the unions? I don't know much about the SPD's relationship to union demands. Situation in the United States indicates a problem between traditional unions and conservative and unions that sprung up upon the development of
new working conditions.
Right. New types of work that require skill. Right? And there is a conflict that played out in American union movements.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know what the situation was in Germany or how it affected the SPD before, for instance.
Well, I mean, they were very active in actually setting up the unions and pushing them, and I think the lesson to be learned is you can't wait for these unions to appear, right? Or for anything to appear. If you want something to appear, you try to push for it. It doesn't mean that you're going to be successful, but it might mean you start the ball rolling too. Because unions in the United States are in a really sad shape.
So I know that this document that you gave to us today was written a little over a year ago. But I'm wondering
Before the primaries.
Yeah, before the primaries.
Or I guess in the midst of the primaries.
I guess I'm wondering, like, on point 7, like the last 2 sentences, you talk about how the dynamics of anti-communism and the Cold War sort of distorted things, but you say we are past this now. I'm wondering, with sort of the Democratic Party's sort of push against Russia, do you feel like that's, like, would you argue that still now, or would that be different now?
It's a little bit insane, isn't it, that people, I think they had Dana Rohrabacher, this crazy anti-communist Republican congressman who's been called an agent of Russia because he's pushing for detente with Russia. And I watched him interviewed on CNN, and the CNN news host said, aren't you being a Soviet apologist? And he had to say, no, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. And I fought my whole life to defeat Soviet communism so that Russia could become a normal nation. Right? And I just want the U.S. to deal with Russia as a normal nation. Right? So I don't think that the anti-Russia stuff has anything to do with socialism or communism. I don't think that anyone's really claiming that. I mean, I guess the Putin was a member of the KGB, but the KGB at a fairly late stage in Soviet history. In other words, they just see him as like a nefarious guy, like not promoting an ideology. Right, and I think that when we were talking about how we're free of anti-communism now, it's kind of like when you apply to be a citizen in the United States, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? It doesn't mean have you ever been a member of a Marxist group. It means have you been a member of the Communist Party, meaning like the party that we're at war with, like the actual Communist Party, right? It doesn't mean like some Trotskyist group, right, or some anarchist organization or something, right? It means, are you an agent of a foreign government, right? And the only ideology that they're concerned with now is Islamism, right, which is specifically a non-state actor, right, except in the case of Iran, right? And so I think that, we are free, I think that it's hard for us to appreciate just how repressive the old Cold War regime really was, right? Where they could actually prosecute you for being the agent of a foreign enemy government for your ideology.
Well, but I mean, isn't Razmaya Oda like a clear example of that?
Who?
Razmaya Oda, there was
terrorism.
Yeah.
Terrorism.
Well, but I mean, what kind of terrorism? Well,
the PFLP.
The PFLP, and the PFLP is...
That's controversial for that reason, right?
No, the PFLP started specifically as a Marxist organization.
No, I mean it's controversial in the sense that whether she's, in other words, what's meant by terrorism. In other words, it's controversial, like liberals can defend someone like that because they can say, look, this is someone who's a Palestinian nationalist, right? And so, they can make the argument, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, right? In a way that liberals aren't going to make that case about ISIS, but they can make it around that case in particular because it's the PFLP. Meaning that you can say, okay, well, PFLP is part of the PLO, and don't we want there to be a Palestinian state? And isn't the PLO the U.S. government's partners in building a Palestinian state? Blah blah blah, right? And so, in other words, you could make a kind of civil liberties and political freedom argument around a case like that.
Right.
You can actually, it's not like beyond the pale or something, because the PFLP is not at war with the U.S.
No, but it's still
right.
It's still marked as a terrorist organization.
But it's not like the Soviet Union or Communist China. That's all that I'm saying.
But the United States is very friendly with Communist China.
Sure.
And produces most of our shit from Communist China. but is like actively hostile and actively opposed to the Communist Party of the Philippines or the Communist Party of India, Naxalites, Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, and also, you know, they're receptive to the PLO in certain ways, but like they're actively hostile.
All that I'm saying is that there's room for maneuver. In other words, that in terms of government repression, you always have to think about the room for maneuver with it. You can't just sort of take it lying down. You can't just, or counter-identify. You can't say, oh, because the government calls me a terrorist, yes, I'm a terrorist, right?
Sure.
Like that's like obviously not going to work, right? You have to argue, no, this is politically legitimate. And even back in the day, I mean, interestingly enough, things are a lot more brutal now than they were in the late 19th century. In other words, in a place like Wilhelmine, you know, the Prussian Empire, or even the Tsarist Empire, they understood you don't just kill these people, your political opponents, because you might need them someday. In other words, you might need to co-opt them as a last resort. And so they treated political prisoners differently than they do today. In other words, today, it's just dehumanization, torture, degradation. That's not the way they treated Marxists in the late 19th century. Because they understood, okay, these political radicals, yeah, we'd like to just kill them, but we might need them, right? And so you have to be thinking about the room for maneuver, always, I think. Otherwise, you're not thinking politically.
Like, that's one of the things that's sort of curious about the United States. You know, it claims to be such a liberal democracy and all this other nonsense. They never had the status of political prisoners, right? You're only a criminal. Right? We don't arrest political people for your politics.
No, in those countries, political prisoners, they were political prisoners precisely because they were still feudal aristocracies. So they had that old system of like, you imprison your feudal rival, you keep them locked up in the tower because you might use them someday. No, or
you got certain privileges.
You got certain privileges. That's right, because
it was an honorable.
It was honorable.
You were wrong. You were dangerous, but you were honorable as opposed to just a criminal.
Like Siberia.
Right. But I think that they treated like Debs like a political prisoner in that respect. For example.
Yeah.
Right.
But
they didn't treat him as just a criminal. They were right. So
there was no special status.
There was no special status. Exactly. In other words, in a liberal system, the paradox is that a feudal system actually has more space for the status of political prisoner, but still. In liberal democracy, when there's been an adequately powerful politics behind it, they've still been careful with their political prisoners.
Can you go back to Kate's initial question, just sort of, if I understood correctly, how much is the ground shifted for organizing on the basis of socialism and communism? Well, famously, the poll running up to the Iowa caucus that featured Bernie Sanders on the ballot said that more than half of the Democratic Party voters there identified as socialists. Now, of course, what that meant was they took Bernie Sanders' platform
and called it socialism,
and that was acceptable. So that could be both a blessing and a curse. So on the one hand, people are totally more open to the question of socialism. On the other hand, we're dealing basically with a generation that's forgotten. Let's begin to forget about the Cold War. We forget about the revolutionary tradition. So I have no view on that.
Even back in the day, in the Cold War era, right, the McCarthyite purges, the Communist Party didn't think of itself as a marginal subculture. Right? They thought of themselves as we're the true inheritors of the American Revolution and of the Civil War, of the Union cause in the Civil War. You know, they identified themselves directly with mainstream political history. In other words, they didn't say, oh yes, we are, you know, these marginal, shady types, and therefore, right? Rather, the assumption was, even at the height of McCarthyite repression, communists still thought of themselves as having a truer appeal to the people than the mainstream politicians, and really in touch with the social civic history in the country than the mainstream politicians were.
I guess my question was, and the Republicans and Democrats believe that as well, which is why they're both so paranoid, right? It's why, like, 1960s, I mean, that entire media, up until like 65,
accused anyone that was against the war of being a communist and meant it seriously. To the point where someone like Dr. Spock went out to protest the war, and he was like seriously accused of it.
Or even, the Pentagon Papers guy.
Right.
Ellsberg, yeah.
Yeah, Daniel Ellsberg. So, he came back from doing his Rand Corporation study of the Vietnam War, and his conclusion was the U.S. was on the wrong side, right? And of course, in the way he understood the sides, right? He basically, the way he understood the side of the communists was, of course, tendentious. But it was, there still could be this idea that, right, so in that respect, it fed the paranoia as well. In other words, that you could be, a mainstream liberal who one day wakes up and decides, actually, I'm for communism. Right? But I think that we'd be happy to have that problem today. Right?
Clarify my question. I guess my question is it a blessing or a curse for us today trying to build a socialist party that people are beginning to forget the revolutionary tradition? It's like long enough in the past that...
What do you mean by forgetting it? You mean taking down the statues of Jefferson?
No,
is that what you mean?
Even if you're organizing like a left group in the 80s, there's sort of, you can't make the case that you're building it sort of building it on top of the ongoing history. There seems to be some sort of disruption, maybe the 90s and 2000s. Now the socialist concept is beginning to reemerge through some sort of, Bernie Sanders was sort of reflective of socialism.
Well, there's the universalism. In other words, I'm thinking about what Bill said about how the socialists claimed Humboldt, right? And how, Debs made a speech in which he said all the founding fathers, if they were alive today, would be part of the Socialist Party. They wouldn't be in the Democrats or the Republican Party. They'd be in the Socialist Party. That kind of universally, I think, is disdained today, and that is an ideological problem. But the question is whether that's an ideological problem on the left or whether that's, really a popular conception. In other words, is it really the case that the vast majority of people associate the Enlightenment or liberalism or revolutionary history with white supremacy or patriarchy?
Democratic Party thing. Like that's like a sort of
well, they trot
woke
they trot out people like Ta-Nehisi Coates or whatever, but he's not like
he's like a Democratic Party ideologue.
No, he's more like an ornament, right?
Right, an ornament.
And also he'd be easy to win over. In other words, he condemned Sanders for being a white supremacist, but then endorsed Sanders anyway. Right, because his perspective was so despairing. He's like, well, the U.S. is going to be white supremacists anyway, and so even though Sanders is a white supremacist, I'd rather have that version of white supremacy. Ta-Nehisi Coates, no, his Atlantic column, it was like beating a drum all year, right? It's like, to go back to the New Deal is white supremacist. But maybe it's not such a bad idea after all, right? So in other words, at the end of the day, he didn't really support Hillary. Right, he might have sown a certain amount of confusion, but not really. In other words, it was weak. It wasn't much of an obstacle.
Where I was going with that, it's just probably like the kind of people that I'm like exposed to all the time, like being in academia and stuff. Like there is a kind of there is a way where all this like sort of anti-universalism seems like spread all over the place, but actually it's not. Like it seems to me to be like a specific kind of.
So I had to
urban intellectual.
I had to go through a kind of PowerPoint presentation video like education thing for my job, teaching at the School of the Art Institute about microaggression, and they trotted out all these crazy people as talking heads talking about microaggression, and I was like, oh shit, what is this? Like, this is some crazy labor discipline I'm being subject to. But then the way it concluded, the way it wrapped up was, yes, everyone is doing microaggressions all the time, and so there's nothing you can do about it anyway, you can just be aware of it. Right? So it wasn't like, don't commit microaggressions, right? Which is, maybe what the academics would conclude, like the sort of specialists in microaggressions, maybe they would sort of tie themselves up in knots. But in terms of corporate America, like corporate America definitely uses the universities to like test market like various human resource like ideology, but that doesn't mean that they like are literally Foucauldian or whatever, because obviously they can't be, right? They can't function that way. Society can't actually function according to those ideologies, but they can give lip service. In other words, what academia does is that it spins these ideologies that serve as lip service for, what's really going on.
And it like makes them seem like sort of intellectually legitimate or whatever.
Up-to-date scientific.
Right.
It gives a kind of scientific patina to whatever they want to do anyway in terms of corporate policy, right? It makes them seem respectable, right? It sort of gives some legitimation. And so we have to be careful that if we're living in the laboratory of this stuff, that's not social reality, right? The laboratory of ideology, of academia, is not social reality.
It was rejected in the election last year.
Exactly.
Well, it was rejected all over the place, meaning it was not only rejected in terms of Trump winning, but it was rejected by Sanders almost winning the nomination. Right? The kind of HR speak, like corporate politics.
And I feel like there's a way in which that is not apparently of the left anymore.
No.
Yeah.
Right.
But it was like in the middle of Obamaism. I feel like that was an illusion that was still there.
Maybe. I think Obama did a lot to disenchant people of it.
Yeah.
In other words, I think Obama got his start editing the Harvard Law Review as like a critical race theorist. And then in power, it became obvious that didn't mean much, other than we're going to pay lip service in certain ways. We're going to have the cop who arrested Henry Louis Gates Jr. over for beers and talk to him about, and when Trayvon Martin was killed, Obama could say, if I had a son, that could be him, right? And that kind of thing. But I think that it was felt to be thin. In other words, it doesn't, really decide anything. But I feel like maybe we did dodge the issue. I mean, really, I want to get back to the issue that was raised, which is to say, is it a kind of deal breaker or conversation stopper to say socialism? Is that what we're dealing with? In other words.
Well, I think both the Sanders campaign, where I had a lot of students who weren't sure about Sanders, but then they looked him on YouTube like everybody does, right? And they said, I remember this woman looks at me and she said, he's been saying that same thing for 20 years.
Yeah.
And she was amazed. I said, yeah, he has. And she goes, well, that's why I'm going to support him. He's not changing his mind.
No, he's consistent.
Right. And the same thing like Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, it looks like the Labour Party did not tank. They didn't win, but they didn't tank like all the polls and so on were predicting. In fact, I read the things this morning, all the big right-wing papers, even the mainstream papers were saying, the Tories are going to increase their margin to 40 seats and blah, 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 huge Tory landslide. It didn't happen, apparently, from what we can tell so far. And it was the same thing. What did Jeremy Corbyn do? He just got up and said the same thing he's been saying since 1979. Right? Didn't come up with anything new or original, but people looked at him and said, well, this guy's honest.
He's consistent.
Right? He's consistent.
Yep.
So
there's a lesson there, absolutely.
I think there's a real lesson there. I mean, I think you get to be too slick. And I think that's one of the problems these neoliberals have, is they're so busy with their focus groups and their latest polls, marketing, trying to figure out how to dress, what words to use, et cetera, that they obviously aren't genuine. I think people feel that. Right? Maybe they can't even articulate that they feel that way, but
I would say that
they feel it.
Socialism is what we make it.
Exactly.
As an ideology, as a politics, I think that we have to define it in practice, right, and really win the meaning of it, rather than shy away from it. or just take it as received wisdom in some way, either, right? In other words, we really have to rediscover it as an actual politics, and in that sense, reclaim it, but also reinvent it, rediscover it, really, rediscover it, because it has gotten shunted into a very narrow definition. I think that Hillary, didn't really work particularly effectively, but she immediately went for, Sanders is an economic reductionist, right? And it's like, that's like straight out of like some liberal arts college class, right? Marxism is economic reductionism, socialism is economic reductionism. It didn't really work though, right? Because he didn't get transfixed by it. In other words, he didn't say, well, yes, just the economy, right? He laid out his own vision, sort of undeterred. And he's, as much of a new leftist as the Clintons were anyway. In other words, he himself would have been against economic reductionism, right? So, yeah, Ed.
Mostly probably because nobody knows what it means, right?
Well, if there's more, that what was it that they said? They said something like raising the minimum wage doesn't get rid of institutional racism.
Right, exactly. It's all about racism.
Right, and Sanders said, well, that's true, but these things go together, right? In other words, it's not either or, right? It's not you either raise the minimum wage or you fight against institutionalized racism. So in other words, he didn't fall for the bait, right? Because that was her argument. Her argument was, that you can make all the economic reforms in the world, but it won't help black people. And Sanders said, is that really true? A. And B, well, you don't have to choose between fighting against racism and fighting for economic justice.
I'm actually been sort of surprised by how much there hasn't been any kind of reference to socialism in the anti-Russia stuff recently. That's been interesting. I think maybe a sign of the moment that we're in, that it hasn't been like a lot of work.
There were these marches, anti-Trump marches, that would paint him.
Hammer and sickle.
Hammer and sickle. And so, if anything, it's like the left that's painting him as a
yes. And that's just like
it's amazing. People are really crazy.
We're doing that it almost isn't worth talking about when we're thinking about it. And I think that's been, it's interesting because I do think part of my experience has been in the last year having gotten to sort of explore both the sectarian left in Chicago and the sort of academic left a little bit in Chicago. A lot of the point I was making about the terminology is just a lot of even the points of discussion just don't exist outside of this space. They're not. I spent 7 years, fairly involved in politics in Louisiana, and never these things never even came up. So a lot of times, the reactions that people are having to the way that the left appears from this vantage point actually don't mean that much outside of this context. They're not as significant as they feel in this context. So, for example, this sort of sense that there's a specific way to speak and you have to speak that way, nobody speaks that way outside of this context. Kind of across the social categories, it's not really talked about.
Great.
That's all I was just going to say.
Well, when we're talking about Chicago, we're talking about the left being the voice basically not doing shit. Right? Well, let's be clear of what we're talking about. We don't want to be Trump. We're against Trump. We're against a rehash of Bush's policies. We don't want to be shit. And that gets interpreted in a lot of different ways, which is, okay, you don't want to be Trump. Well, you want to be this soft pile of shit, right? You want to be the social democrats. You want to be these left liberal Democrats. And that'll be your pile of shit that you're going to form in. You're the hard wing. And we're like, no, we're not one of you. We're not playing into the sectarian Republican versus Democrat game. They were against Russia. Now they're for Russia. Now you're against Russia. You're spouting the same anti-communist shit that we've heard for the last 50 years from them. And now it's coming from the other party. We don't buy it. And so, this sort of force of, we don't buy your bullshit is really getting manifest, admittedly, well here, right? It's a good discussion, and I've at least been very enlightened from it. Hopefully you all have as well. But like, as far as concrete politics, we're talking PSL. We're talking the left, the commie, Marxist, sellout, whatever, right?
Party for Socialism and Liberation.
Yeah, Party for
North Korea.
Party for North Korea, sure. And you know what?
For real.
No, that's totally accurate. And it's easy right now to like slam them, to like criticize them, to like say how much they suck, say how much I'm disenfranchised with their approach, which I am. But like, who's leading Chicago? I mean, we are an element, and we should become a bigger element, and we should add nuance, and we should have conversations where we add nuance.
You mean they're leading the demos against Trump?
Yeah.
Well, but that's nothing. That's really nothing. And so that's the other thing, is that obviously, like, a socialist politics can't just be protest demos. It can't be street theater. It's got to be something else.
Sure, and
let them have that. I mean, it's cool. Let them have it. Yeah, in other words, yelling at Trump Tower, where's it going to get you?
It makes me feel better. Like, just to be honest.
But we shouldn't feel better. We shouldn't feel better. This has got to be a marathon. It's got to be training for a marathon. It shouldn't feel good. Not right away.
No, but is it better to sit holed up in your apartment and just be like, oh yeah?
No, of course not. Absolutely not. No, of course, yeah. If that's the choice between being lost in your apartment reading things on the internet and dealing with human beings on the street, yeah, of course, do the latter, right? But the PSL are not human beings, right? So no, I mean really, there are better options. There are better options.
Yes, I'll make it feel good.
That feels good.
No, but in reality, so besides organizing the anti-Trump demos, what does the PSL do? They do anti-racism stuff, don't they? Yeah. So if you think about the actual activism that they do, rather than just the kind of occasional demo kind of front group stuff, because there is a division of labor on the left, so the ISO is more ensconced in the labor movement, and PSL is more with anti-racism organizing and community organizing at that level. But they both end up feeding into the Democrats, because the Democrats have their feet in both of those camps, right? In other words, if you're a person of color, you're more likely to be a PSLer. If you're a white person, you're more likely to be an ISOer. But you both end up as Democrats in the end, right? So, or your old comrades, the FRSO, right? Yeah. There are two FRSOs, of course, and but the East Coast FRSO, they have the Malcolm X organization as one front group, but then they also have the Progressive Democrats of America that they participate in through Bill Fletcher Jr., right? And so they're Democrats too, right? So the question is, what do they actually do besides being fringe Democrats? What do they actually do? Well, right, and that's where we have to compete.
The thing is, if you're talking about the FRSO that all of you know and love,
the Midwest FRSO.
Yeah, that they're, I guess, the West FRSO. They're the Midwest FRSO. They're Chicago, they're Illinois, they're Minneapolis, they're St. Louis. Very, very few. They crapped out in St. Louis for various reasons. Utah, all over California, all over the Southwest, and it is the FRSO that people say, oh, it's just the crazy one. Right, it's the fringe. Well, now is the time of the fringe. Now we have a time to break with what is a social democrat? Well, we know what a social democrat is. We have 100 years of social democrat to tell us what a social democrat is. It seems that now is the opportune time to break, where it's not just someone who is, oh, well, I'm against capitalism in like my vague, speechy ways, and I'm against capitalism, and we need to study more. But like, no, I'm going out there,
Even Hillary's joined the resistance. So you saw the interview that she did with Zach Garifullakis, right?
Yeah.
Where, before the election, where he said, so, you know, what are you going to do if Trump gets elected? And she said, well, I'm not going to pick up the gun. Which was interesting because she had to say it.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so, you know, if we say now is the time of the fringe, what you mean is now is the time of the Democratic Party being in the minority. That's what you really mean. You don't really mean anything else because there's no resistance, right? What we mean is that under Trump, liberals get to pretend that they're radical, right? And so the question, you know, today is, again, if these groups are doing anything besides being the radical niche marketing of the Democratic Party, then we have to pay attention to what they actually do. In other words, I know the FRSO operates in the Teamsters for a Democratic Union. They do organizing at that level. And so we have to pay attention to the real stuff that they do, rather than the positions that they take, or the propaganda that they espouse, or the affinities that they exhibit, or the street demos that they conduct, right? Like, what's the actual organizing that these groups do? That one should take seriously, and that's why we say, look, when we look at the left today, there are, you know, skilled, talented organizers and thinkers, but everything that they do ultimately serves the Democrats.
But as, well, one thing, I mean, at the time of the fringe, I wouldn't say that it's the time of the fringe because of the resistance or because of anybody doing any anti-Trump thing. But I would say that there is...
Because I lived through the 80s, right, under Reagan, and it seemed like it was the time of the fringe. Meaning it seemed like, you know, everyone was a radical. Like, to be anti-Reagan, like Jesse Jackson was a radical because he was like, you know, he supported the frontline states against apartheid South Africa, right? He supported terrorists, right? He embraced Yasser Arafat, right? That was just the Democratic Party. That was nothing but, like, it had nothing to do. All that the PLO is the Palestinian Democratic Party.
Right.
That's right.
What I wanted to bring up at the time of the fringe, not in the sense of the organized resistance or the Democratic Party being radical, is the opposite. It's that the Democrats' resistance is so apparently bankrupt, I feel like, and not just
unlike in the 80s, actually. In other words, it seemed to have legs.
No, that, what I'm saying is that
right.
there's a sense where there is no sort of project. There's no like legitimacy from any mainstream sort of political nobody's like excited about what the establishment politics promises.
The Maoists ran the Harold Washington campaign, and when I lived in New York growing up, David Dinkins was mayor of New York City. He was a member of the DSA. And the Manhattan Borough President, Ruth Messenger, was a member of the DSA. Right? It was a different world.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up, not to sort of go against what you were saying about these different groups, but I think, at least in my perspective, and again, I was born in 1988, so you've seen a lot more of the world than I have, but I feel like the Democrats now have put themselves in a position that they're going to find it difficult to recover from. When it became revealed that they basically stole the nomination of Bernie, isolating a lot of what their previous base would have been. So I guess what I want to say is that I think there's a difference there. I think like the idea that, this is just feeding into the Democratic Party when PSL decides to hold an anti-Trump protest is kind of incorrect, because I think people are going to these protests.
We'll see, is all I have to say.
Fair enough. But I mean,
check in with me in 4 years.
I just think that like saying that, these groups are just feeding into the Democratic Party, particularly in this point in time, is incorrect, because a lot of the
because it doesn't sound good.
No, I just think a lot of the people going to these protests are fed up with the Democratic Party, and that's why you're seeing protests that have been larger in numbers than I have ever seen, personally. And also, like, for example, Inauguration Day protests were larger than I've ever seen. I've actually personally never seen an an inauguration day protest. Now, again, I've lived a less amount of time than you, so you can say I'm wrong, but I think part of it is fueled by this frustration with the Democratic Party.
But the inauguration day protest was the women's movement.
No. There was an inauguration. No, I feel like the inauguration stuff and the women's march, that was all very Democratic Party. It felt like it also felt very like urban, managerial, professional kind of business.
Are you talking about the day after inauguration or inauguration day itself? Because inauguration day itself had, I believe, a very different character.
Well, just the idea of protesting that the Democrats didn't win. That's what it seemed like.
Well, again, the thing is not who showed up at a demo. The question is, how are people being organized in an ongoing way?
Well, if we're talking about the day after, that wasn't the Democrats. It wasn't the Democrats I know, because, sorry, I had a brain injury. Guy with his shirt, and then, and the thing, and then,
You mean a Chicago activist?
Yes. He was
not Chewy.
No, it was the guy.
Not the gay guy.
No, it's the guy.
I think he has a mustache, but maybe not.
No.
You know who I'm talking about?
No, it's not Chewy.
He was a Sanders supporter. He's the
PSL guy.
Oh, well.
John Beecham. John
Okay.
Beecham. I was in town. John Beecham was like, "Hey, I hear you're in town. Do you want to speak?" And I said, "All right, I'll speak, and I'll just, shoot from the cuff from whatever fucking Socialist Party position I have, such as it is, right?" And I'm like, "Hey, yeah, fuck this, fuck all these guys, fuck all this, whining and protest of Trump stole whatever. Your candidate was so bad that they fucking lost to Trump. So now we need to wake up and we appreciate the PSL." And by the way, this did not go over well. It was a large contingent of various forces. I was not the most radical speaker there. PSL called the event, called the protest, had the most radical speaker there, and I was one of the radical speakers who was like, "Look, it doesn't matter because this is serving capital. This is serving to get it ahead." That was the day after the protest. The march that was the "Don't rock the boat," Democrats enforce whatever, was the Saturday after, which was the largest in Minneapolis history, recent history, in fact. It was 22 million, or
nationally.
It was 22 million nationally. It was a lot. It was 270 people in Chicago, 10,000. And what did we do to organize them, to turn them against the Democratic Party? I know that I was worn out and I had shit to get to for, my union. So I'm kind of backing off there. But you were going to, but then were held back at the behest of the FRSO. And as far as I can tell, there was no PSL, there was no ISO, there was no people operating fundamentally different from the unions and workers' organizations they were part of. There was no red presence whatsoever in that. I'm talking about that. Does anyone know Contra?
The question is, in either of those cases, what would have happened if Hillary got elected? Because it sounds like Saturday wouldn't have happened, based on what you just said.
Yeah.
The question is whether, the day after, what would have been? Would there have been marches against Hillary since and by? Because it doesn't seem like
I think not. Right. What?
Yeah, of course there would not have been any protests if Hillary had been elected.
Isn't that the idea that if they weren't mere...
You're protesting that Hillary lost.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that the idea? And so there's not... I think we falls to assign any sort of socialist consciousness to it, or even some sort of radical consciousness outside of protesting the law.
Yeah, my specific, I would say my own opinion about this, my own specific attitude towards this is that, it's absurd to protest against Trump taking office. It's like the Hollywood people who were appealing to the Electoral College to vote their conscience and not vote for Trump. I think you have to, organize against specific actions by the government.
I also think there's a larger issue here, if I could comment on this discussion, is without an alternative to the Democratic Party. Where are all these radicals?
Yeah,
I've been around even longer than this. And I've seen a lot of people hated the Democratic Party. You have no idea how much we hated the Democratic Party during Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson.
Of course, yeah.
But the fact is, if there's no alternative to the Democratic Party, people are going to be left with one or two alternatives.
Right.
Crawl back in the Democratic Party because it's changed, because we have to be practical, or be demoralized and withdraw from political activity.
Right.
Right. That unfortunately
is the dynamic.
Is the structural dynamic. It's not like there's a delinka you could go to for all its problems and so on. There's not an alternative.
Right.
And that's why I think Chris, I don't mean to speak
go ahead.
but I think that's what Chris is talking about the need to build a socialist party that's all encompassing, is so there is some sort of alternative, right? Beyond like various little groups like, the RCP dragging out Cornel West, talk to Bob Avakian, Freedom Road and Joe Eisenbaker, blah blah blah. Something that's a real alternative.
Which can't happen overnight.
You've been in the Socialist Party, subsequently DSA.
Yeah, I guess. I'm going to claim I don't remember that.
Well, can you tell us more about your experience in the Socialist Party? Like how that sort of,
Well, I've never seen anybody in a Jello wrestling match.
Right.
But it probably there's no there in a sense. That was sort of a problem. There was nothing. It was sort of like.
Which is a shame because it was a lot more real then than it is now.
Yeah, I know, but
and still it was a Jello match.
It was still. It was like there was sort of no there. People kind of did whatever they wanted, thought whatever they did. People drifted in and out, and DSA, that's nothing more than a mailing list to support the Democratic Party liberals. It's. For example, I was in the Democratic Socialist America, thinking that there was some socialist to the group, and so I proposed that we have a debate about whether the left should support Barack Obama. It's not that they said no. It's that the looks on their face was like I had entered a seminary and told the assembled group of theology professors that the Virgin Mary wasn't. It was like they just looked at me like we would have a discussion about whether to support Barack Obama. It was like they just looked, their mouths fell open, right? It was the last meeting I attended, but they just couldn't. I said, but we don't have to take a position. Let's just have a discussion.
Talk about it.
Let's talk about it. They wouldn't even talk about it. So anyhow, you asked me. Yeah, no, it's
If I can follow up on that, I know a lot of people today say that the DSA is different. DSA has changed. Now
you mean it's different now than 8 years ago?
After Bernie.
Was that possible?
You gotta be kidding.
I know. Now this is
gotta be kidding.
I'm getting too old for this shit, man.
Yeah, I know.
I'm getting too old for this shit. No, really.
Yeah, I'm way too old for this shit.
Yeah, because you gotta deal with every passing illusion.
Yeah, and have people heard of Solidarity? This little, they're joining. Apparently, they're joining DSA. Blah blah blah.
Well, they've had membership growth plus the rise of the so-called left caucus in opposition to the A-Flo-Granov caucus. So.
Who are the ex-platypus people, by the way? The left caucus. Yeah, we've created this Frankenstein monster.
Are you kidding?
It's really that's horrible. It's really horrible. I know. It's really bad. Yeah. I know.
I'm sorry. there's ex-platypus people like out there.
Yeah, of course, who are doing stuff.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Yeah.
I'm confused. So there's ex-platypus people. Okay, and they quit. I got that.
Yeah.
So far, so good.
Who are in the leadership of the left caucus of the DSA.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
God.
Even Bhaskar is something of an ex-platypus person, actually. Yeah, platypus. Yeah, we influenced Bhaskar, and it's terrible. I mean, in some ways, it's good because I think it clarified for these people that they're not Marxists. In other words, that we gave them like straight up Marxism, 100, like 180 proof Marxism, and they were like, yeah, no, thank you. Right.
I'll have orange juice instead.
No, so that's always useful, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think Bhaskar said that he used to think that he was a follower of Karl Kautsky, but then he realized he's not even a follower of Harrington, but rather of Ralph Miliband. And I said, well, that's honest.
Look how his sons turned out.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, don't give Ralph Miliband such a bad name, actually, right? And certainly Harrington was better than anything in the DSA today. But, it's like, okay, you know what I mean? It's like, people use Marxism to justify all sorts of things, right? So at least, there's been a little bit of a point among these millennials who had some contact with platypus that they're like, okay, we understand via platypus that Marxism is actually this other thing, and we don't want that. Yeah. We might like to think of ourselves as Marxists, but if we had to be honest, we know we're not Marxists. And that's true. That's true. And I'd rather that happen more.
Clarity's always good.
Clarity, right? But at the same time, it's not like a matter of ideology. In other words, it's a matter of lowered expectations.
Yeah.
Meaning, because it doesn't matter what you like, what your intellectual framework is. It matters what you're doing and whether you can sustain it, right? I mean, it does matter intellectually to be clear about what you're doing. But hell, it'd be nice to have some, Lassalleanism, nowadays in comparison to what we've got.
Well, I think that's a structural problem with DSA, quite frankly, is they really have a certain reformist impatience. And so the only way to get the trash picked up from the daycare center is to talk to the alderman. And so they structurally, because they want to, quote, get things done, like the Chicago DSA is like so big into this living wage ordinance thing in Oak Park, like socialism in one suburb or something. I don't know. I mean, they really are, because that's how they get things done. So they really are tied to the Democratic Party, because in the here and now, in the next couple of years, the only way they're going to get these motions passed in Oak Park is to suck up to the Democratic Party of Oak Park. I mean, so it flows from that logic. If you want to get something done in the next 3 months,
and the thing
you
is,
better talk to the Democrats.
It's not like the issue of political independence doesn't mean just disdaining the Democrats. Because you could even work with the Democrats, but from a position of independence.
Right.
Right.
Organize. So if organizing at rallies is the way to go for a future Socialist Party or something, what would it mean? Is it even acceptable to try to organize among Republican voters and try to organize? See what I'm saying? Because I think we tend to believe that the origins of the left are going to stem from trying to pick away Democratic Party voters.
Well, of course, in Chicago, it's a one-party state, right? So everybody's a Democrat, meaning a lot of people here who are Democrats should by rights be Republicans, but they're not. But even then, right, there is a question of the independent voters, in other words, the people who are the swing voters who vote for whomever, and then there are the non-voters. In other words, there's a whole world of people out there who are not particularly affiliated, and who aren't even wedded to any particular
rallies. Or know that the rally's gone?
Well, they could show up at rallies. In other words, people, protests happen. People do show up at demos out of outrage. That happens. That's legitimate. But if we're talking about the organizers, in other words, that if you have organizations whose main purpose is to organize protest demos, that's different from the people who happen to show up. Right? It's not wrong to demonstrate and protest. But the question is, if you're an organization that's your only purpose in this world, is to organize protest demos, to distribute signs at protest demos, right? Then you're not really organizing people. Because these groups that organize the protest demos, they understand that they're organizing tens of thousands of people on the street so that they might be able to recruit 3 or 4 naive young people, right? In other words, their organizational goals are very limited, right? They might do these things, but in terms of building their organization, they're only trying to build propaganda groups. They're only trying to build really tiny groups. They're just trying to keep their own tiny groups going. Right? They're not organizing people. They're only recruiting cadre.
I'm sorry, I got to take off. I just wanted to plug really quick that we have a date for the next Socialist Salon, which is July 5th. It's a Wednesday. We haven't booked anything yet, but I thought this worked out, so I guess I'll talk to you about me booking it here.
What about the 6th? What about the 6th?
We can do the 6th. It's Ed's friend Chris from 33rd, working bar family. He's like an activist. He's got like this built-in constituency that I guess Carrie and Ed went to one of their meetings. They were really interested in socialism. They have a constituency that they want us to do to teach them socialist texts.
Great.
He said that the 6th was an option also, but he would prefer the 5th.
Okay.
I guess.
Okay.
Is that
cool?
Yeah. Would you prefer the 6th? That you're saying?
I know that there's other stuff going on the 5th, and that's the day after the 4th of July.
Yeah, that's the thing.
So it might be good to give one day for hangovers.
Well,
great.
We got everybody. Facebook event.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.